There is a government document with a death toll in it for a disaster that has not happened yet. 13,800 Americans. And that number is not a prediction about the earthquake. It is a prediction about what people do in the 15 minutes after the shaking stops. The fault is the settled part. We know the last time it broke, down to the evening, and we know roughly what it will do next. The thing nobody can measure is you. Here is what the government expects, and here is why most of the people it expects to die will have had enough time to walk out. Before you decide this is a Pacific Northwest story, understand what that model is actually measuring, because it is not rock. In every emergency that has ever been studied, in building fires and sinking ships and aircraft evacuations, researchers find the same gap. Between the moment a person knows something is wrong and the moment they actually move, there is a delay. They look around to see what everyone else is doing. They gather their things. They try to phone someone. They wait for an announcement. Emergency researchers have a name for that delay. They call it milling. And it is not panic. Panic is rare, and it is mostly a myth. Milling is close to universal. The Cascadia casualty model does not primarily model geology. Geology is the easy half. What it models is milling, and the reason it produces a death toll in the thousands rather than the hundreds is a set of assumptions about how long people will stand still. So keep one thing in the back of your mind for the next 20 minutes. At the end of this, I am going to show you a school on the Washington coast and 875 people who voted to change that number. They are the proof it is not fixed. Let us start with the fault, because it is genuinely strange. The Cascadia Subduction Zone runs about 600 miles from Vancouver Island down past Seattle and Portland to Northern California. It is the boundary where a slab of oceanic crust called the Juan de Fuca Plate is diving underneath the North American plate. That is the same machinery that produced the 2004 Sumatra earthquake and the 2011 earthquake in Japan. Subduction zones make the largest earthquakes the planet is capable of, and they are the only faults that can reach magnitude 9. But Cascadia does something that no other major subduction zone does. It is quiet. Most subduction zones grind. They produce a steady background chatter of small earthquakes as the plates scrape past each other, and seismologists can read that chatter. Cascadia produces almost nothing. For decades, that silence was interpreted the way you might reasonably interpret silence, which is as an absence of danger. We now read it the other way. The quiet is the problem. A fault that is not slipping in small increments is a fault that is stuck, and a stuck fault is not resting. It is loading. GPS stations across Oregon and Washington show the coastline being squeezed and lifted, compressed eastward, storing elastic strain like a bent plank. At some point, the plank straightens. And we know exactly what that looks like, because it has happened, and one of the most remarkable pieces of detective work in the history of geology tells us the date. Go and stand on the Copalis River, on the coast of Washington, at low tide. There is a forest there, and it is dead. Gray trunks of western red cedar, standing upright in a tidal marsh, stripped and weathered, rooted in ground that is now salt water. They are called ghost forests, and there are others, at Neskowin in Oregon, and up and down that coastline. For a long time, nobody could say what killed them, or when. In the mid-1980s, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, named Brian Atwater, started digging into the marsh soils along that coast and found something that should not have been there. Layers of tidal mud sitting on top of buried forest soil, with a thin sheet of sand between them. That sequence tells a very specific story. The ground did not sink slowly, over centuries, the way a marsh normally drowns. It dropped, all at once, and salt water came in and killed the trees where they stood. And the sand layer on top is what a tsunami leaves behind. Then, a dendrochronologist named David Yamaguchi read the tree rings. The trees stopped growing after the 1699 season. All of them. The last complete ring in those cedars was laid down in the summer of 1699, and there was no 1700 ring at all, which means every one of those trees died in the dormant season, in the winter between the two. That is an astonishing constraint. Radiocarbon dating could get within a few decades. Tree rings got it to a single winter, and they got it across at least 90 kilometers of coastline simultaneously, which meant one event, not many. But it still could not give a day. The day came from the other side of the Pacific. In the last week of January 1700, along the northeastern coast of Japan, in villages including one called Kuwagasaki, a tsunami came ashore in the middle of the night. It flooded houses and farmland, and there had been no earthquake. Nobody had felt anything. Japanese record-keeping in that period was extraordinary. Village headmen, merchants, and samurai scribes wrote it down, in detail, with dates, and those documents survived for 300 years in Japanese archives. Because there was no local earthquake attached to it, later scholars had a name for it. They called it an orphan tsunami. In the 1990s, a Japanese seismologist named Kenji Satake went looking for its parent. He worked backwards. A tsunami crossing the open Pacific travels at a known speed. If you know when it arrived in Japan, and you know the wave heights the villagers recorded, you can calculate where it started, how big the source was, and when. It started off the coast of North America, and the rupture happened at around 9 in the evening, Pacific time, on the 26th of January, 1700. 2 reconstructions, built independently, in 2 languages, from separate archives an ocean apart. Atwater's mud said within a few decades. Yamaguchi's tree rings said one winter. Satake's Japanese village records said 9 o'clock at night on a Tuesday. They all met on the same evening. The wave heights in those Japanese documents imply a magnitude somewhere near 9, a rupture on the order of 1,000 kilometers long, and an average slip of about 20 meters. In places, the coastline dropped 6 feet in minutes, which is why the cedars are standing in salt water. And the indigenous nations of that coast had been saying so the entire time. Oral histories from Vancouver Island and elsewhere describe the ground shaking at night, the sea coming in, and whole villages lost. Those accounts were treated as folklore until the mud and the tree rings and the Japanese archives caught up with them. Now, here is the part that reframes everything about the buildings on that coast. Nobody believed any of this until about 40 years ago. Cascadia was not thought to be a sleeping monster. It was thought to be inert. The prevailing scientific view into the 1980s was that this subduction zone was aseismic, that the plates were sliding quietly past one another without ever locking, and that the Pacific Northwest simply did not do great earthquakes. That was not negligence. It was a reasonable reading of the available evidence, which was silence. It was also wrong. Which means the seismic building codes of Seattle and Portland were written for a fault that the people writing them did not believe could kill anybody. The bridges, the schools, the hospitals, the unreinforced brick buildings, the water mains, all of it went up under a set of assumptions that the mid-1980s deleted. The region is not badly built. It is built for the wrong earthquake, and the correction only started arriving in the 1990s. So that is the loaded system. Now, let me show you the 15 minutes that decide the number, because this is where it stops being a story about rocks. When Cascadia goes, the shaking on the coast is expected to last somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, and possibly longer. Sit with that, because it is much stranger than it sounds. A severe earthquake in California lasts perhaps 15 to 30 seconds. This is 5 minutes. It is long enough to become boring, and then terrifying, and then boring again. Then it stops. And the clock starts. The tsunami arrives on the outer coast in roughly 10 to 30 minutes, depending on where you stand. Now, the state of Oregon has done something about this that I think is one of the most extraordinary pieces of public communication any government has ever produced, and almost nobody outside the region knows it exists. It is called Beat the Wave. Working with the United States Geological Survey, Oregon's Department of Geology and Mineral Industries modeled pedestrian evacuation for coastal communities up and down the state. Not driving, walking. They took the road and trail network, the slope of every segment, the ground cover, and a model of how fast human beings actually walk uphill, and they calculated, for every location in the inundation zone, how quickly a person would have to move to get out before the water arrives. Then they printed it as a map. Town by town, neighborhood by neighborhood, free, downloadable. And on those maps, the roads are colored by speed. I want to be clear about what that means, because when I understood it, I had to sit back from the screen. There are published maps of American towns where each street is color-coded according to how fast you have to move along it in order to live. Some streets you can walk. Some streets you have to walk quickly. Some you have to run. And for some locations, the honest answer in the model is that there is no speed that works, which is why the same program also looks at building refugees. The maps assume the bridges are gone. In the modeling for Cannon Beach, for instance, the analysis is run on the basis that the Ecola Creek and Highway 101 bridges fail during the earthquake, because that is the realistic case. They also assume you are not in a car, because you will not be. Roads buckle, they liquefy, they fill with debris and downed lines, and every other person on that coast is trying to leave at the same moment. The single most useful sentence Oregon's Tsunami Office has published is this one: evacuation on foot will be the only means possible. Which brings us back to milling. Because if you look at the research on evacuation modeling, one finding comes up again and again, and it is the reason this whole video exists. Studies of tsunami mortality find that milling time and the participation rate, meaning how many people leave at all, have significant nonlinear effects on the death toll. Nonlinear, not proportional. It is not the case that hesitating twice as long doubles your risk. Past a certain point, the curve turns upward and takes a great many people with it, because everybody is walking a route that was calculated with almost no slack in it. 5 minutes of milling is not 5 minutes of inconvenience. On many of those colored streets, 5 minutes of milling is the entire margin. And that is what the 13,000 is. It is not a measurement of the fault. It is an assumption about how many people stand in the driveway looking at their phone. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, the mechanism instead of the montage, subscribe. That is the only thing I am going to ask you for. Now let me put you inside those 5 minutes properly, because I have described them as a clock, and they are not a clock. They are the worst 5 minutes those communities have ever had. Your first problem is that you cannot stand up. In shaking of that intensity, walking is difficult, and running is close to impossible. So a meaningful part of your evacuation window is spent on the ground waiting for the ground to stop. Your second problem is the soil. Much of the developed land around Puget Sound, the Columbia River, and the coastal estuaries is soft sediment and artificial fill, and saturated fill behaves badly in long-duration shaking. It liquefies. It stops being ground and starts being something closer to a heavy liquid, and roads laid across it crack, tilt, and sink. Your third problem is that everything designed to help you is broken by the same 5 minutes. Bridges, water mains, mobile networks, both because towers fail and because everyone in 3 states picks up their phones simultaneously. The Interstate 5 bridge over the Columbia River, connecting Portland to Washington, is expected to fail. That is not a controversial claim, it is in the planning documents, and both states have been trying to fund a replacement for years. And a fourth thing, which is the one that will decide the number. Nobody is going to tell you to go. There is no official warning that beats this physics. For a local tsunami generated on the fault directly offshore, no agency can detect it, verify it, and push an alert to you faster than the water can travel. That is not a criticism of anyone. It is arithmetic. So the earthquake is the warning. That is the entire system. If you are on that coast and the ground shakes hard for more than a minute, that shaking is the alert. It is the only alert you will get. And the correct response is to start moving uphill while it is still happening. Now here are the numbers themselves, and I have to be careful with them because there is more than one. The most widely cited comes from a Federal Emergency Management Agency Region 10 plan from 2022. If the earthquake and tsunami happened tomorrow, more than 13,800 people could die, and 107,000 could be injured, with economic damage across Washington, Oregon, and California exceeding $70 billion. Earlier planning figures for the Cascadia Rising exercises put Washington state alone at 8,440 fatalities and 12,114 injuries. You will see all of those numbers reported interchangeably, and they are not the same number. Different scenarios, different rupture assumptions, different years, different geographies. Anyone quoting you one figure with total confidence has not read the documents. But here is the caveat that actually matters, and it is the National Guard's own language, not mine. That Washington fatality estimate, they noted, does not account for exposure, disease, dehydration, starvation, or follow-on tsunamis and aftershocks. Read that again. The published death toll is the number of people killed by the earthquake and the wave. It explicitly excludes everybody who dies afterward, in a region where the roads are gone and the water is not running. The number is not the ceiling, it is the floor. And the rest of the planning gives you the scale of the afterward. More than 1.25 million people needing mass feeding and drinking water, 500,000 damaged homes, 410,000 people needing emergency shelter, and 254,357 pets. I include that because it tells you something no adjective can. Somebody sat down and counted the animals. This is not a vague warning about a scary fault. It is a logistics problem that people have been quietly costing out, line by line, for a decade. One more detail from inside those models that I have not seen reported anywhere. The casualty runs are done at 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 5 in the afternoon. The death toll is a function of what time of day the fault lets go, because that determines whether people are in their homes, in school, in an office block, or on a bridge in traffic. There is a number for the school day and a number for the middle of the night, and they are not the same. Now, 3 things are going to be in the comments, and one of them was in the actual news this year. The first is that Cascadia is shutting down. In April of this year, seismic imaging off Vancouver Island revealed a tear in the subducting plate, and a wave of coverage suggested the fault might be fragmenting and winding down. It is a real and genuinely fascinating finding. It does not mean what people hoped. The researchers were explicit that subduction and the seismic hazard continue, that strain is still accumulating in the locked segments, and that a more structurally complex plate boundary may make earthquake behavior harder to predict rather than less dangerous. Complicated is not the same as safe. The second is that this is fear-mongering, and I have some sympathy with that, because Cascadia coverage has a long history of apocalypse porn. So, let me hand you the actual state of the science, including the parts that cut against me. A study in 2024 questioned the reliability of parts of the Cascadia earthquake record derived from undersea sediment layers. Research from the University of Washington this year found that the northern part of the fault is locked and building strain, while the central section appears to leak fluid, which may mean the whole margin does not always rupture at once. The picture is genuinely more complicated than one big fault breaking end to end. The third is the shaking estimate, and this one goes the other way. At a conference this year, a United States Geological Survey seismologist named Aaron Worth presented work suggesting the plate interface near the northern Oregon coast sits about 5 kilometers shallower than previously thought, which could increase peak ground shaking there by roughly 9 to 17%. Her team also mapped a deep sedimentary basin under Tillamook, and basins amplify shaking. That work was presented at a meeting, so treat it as preliminary rather than settled. It points in the unhelpful direction. And now the question everyone actually wants answered, which is when. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and nobody can. Great Cascadia earthquakes appear in the geologic record roughly every 300 to 500 years, with 19 events identified over the last 10,000 years. January of 2025 marked 325 years since the last one. That sounds ominous, and I would gently point out that an average is not a schedule. Faults do not keep appointments. It could be this afternoon. It could be in 200 years, which is longer than anyone watching this will be alive. That gap between knowing a fault is loaded and knowing when it breaks is exactly why the 13,000 is worth arguing about. You cannot prepare for a date. You can only prepare for a certainty. Which brings me back to the school. Westport, Washington, sits on a peninsula in Grays Harbor County with water on 3 sides and no high ground within reach. The modeling says the tsunami arrives in about 20 minutes. There is nowhere to walk to. On the beat the wave logic, that town is one of the places where the honest answer is that no walking speed works. Their evacuation plan used to be to move the children to the 2nd floor of the high school, a building from the late 1980s that might not survive the earthquake in the first place. So the Ocosta School District proposed replacing its elementary school with a building whose gymnasium roof is an engineered tsunami refuge. Reinforced to survive magnitude 9 shaking and then the water on top of it. 50-odd feet above sea level, reached by 4 concrete stair towers with room for around 1,000 people. The voters turned it down twice. On the 3rd attempt, in April of 2013, 875 residents cast ballots, and it passed with 69.78%. $13.8 million, paid off over 20 years in a small coastal town. It opened in 2016, the first tsunami vertical evacuation structure in North America. The superintendent who saw it through was named Paula Ackerlund, and she put the reason for the whole thing in 7 words. You are not going to be able to drive anywhere. Here is the figure from that project I cannot get out of my head. Making a building do this job, rather than just be a building, costs an additional 10 to 20%. 10 to 20% is the difference between a school where the children have somewhere to go and a school where they do not. So, the practical part, and it is unusually specific for a video like this. If you live on or ever visit the Oregon or Washington coast, go and find the Beat the Wave map for that exact place and do it before you need it. They are free, they are published by the state, and they are drawn for individual neighborhoods. Look at the color of your own street. Find the route that does not cross a bridge. If the ground shakes hard for more than a minute, treat that as the warning, because it is the only one you are getting. Do not wait for a siren. Do not check the news. Do not drive. Go up, not inland, because it is elevation that saves you rather than distance, and keep going until you are well past the line on the map. And know your route before you need it, because milling is not a decision people make. It is what happens by default when you have not decided in advance. That is the whole thing. The people who die in that model are overwhelmingly not the ones who were unlucky about where they stood. They are the ones who spent the first 5 minutes finding out what was happening. So there is a number in a federal document, 13,800. The date is not up to anybody. The magnitude is not up to anybody. The ground under Seattle and Portland was laid down long before there was anyone here to have an opinion about it. But that figure is not a measurement of the fault. It is an assumption about a 15-minute window, written down in advance by people who had to put something on the page. It is the only number in the entire plan that is still a draft. And the edits get made now, in bond measures and drills and printed maps on a refrigerator door, and in whether you know, without having to look, which way is uphill.